President Bola Tinubu in his speech, of course, the inaugural address at the Eagle Square in Abuja. He says his administration will create agricultural hubs throughout the nation to increase food production and engage in value-added processing. The president emphasized that the livestock sector would be introduced to the best modern practices and steps taken to minimize the perennial conflicts over land and water resources in the sector. Let's talk more about President Tinubu's agenda for the agricultural sector. Of course, starting with where we are at the moment with all of the moves being made by the previous administration. I'm being joined by a researcher and agribusiness economist from the United Kingdom, Dr. Matthew Ojo. Dr. Ojo, good afternoon, and thank you so much for your time.
Good afternoon, Tolu. Thanks for having me on your program today. And good afternoon to our viewers at home.
Yes, interestingly, a lot of promises in that speech. But before we go into details of some very interesting stuff that has to do with the agricultural sector, I'd like you to let us understand where we are in our agricultural sector with development in Nigeria. It's not all bad news because we still have food produce, even if it's a bit expensive. But where are we? Before we now get to how we can get better.
Thanks, Tolu, for starting this way. You see, generally, world over, even in science, when you want to measure performances, you will look at indicators, okay? Usually, you want to look at what was the baseline indicators like when you started a thing, and then you want to look at what those same indicators are saying at the end line when you end something. So if you ask where we are now, let me just pick a single indicator for us to have an understanding. Because when we say it's not all that bad, maybe we have to understand what it is that we're in currently. You see, in 2015, when President Buhari took over, the economists usually release what they call the Global Food Security Index, all right? That index looks at food in a country as it concerns affordability, availability, it will look at quality and safety, and then it looks at sustainability and adaptation. Adaptation in the sense of how is production adapted to vagaries of climate or risks posed by climate. As of 2015, Tolu, Nigeria was ranked 91 out of 109 countries, okay? So you could say we were better from the bottom by about 18 positions. Now, as of last year, which is just the year before President Buhari left, in terms of food security globally, Nigeria was ranked 107 out of 113 countries. So in other words, we are just 6 positions from the bottom. And if you look at that report, we were just better than about 6 countries. Let me mention them so that you have an idea of the kind of countries that we are talking about. We're better than Burundi, Madagascar, Sierra Leone, Yemen, Syria, and I think one other country, I can't remember now. So maybe that will give you an understanding of where we are. Because what sum up a country's agricultural production, apart from those figures you see, somebody comes and says we are contributing 27% or 23% to the national GDP, fine. But the question is, how food secure is Nigeria as of today? If you ask me, the scorecard is reading red.
Well, when we start this way, we now move into, because time is never on our side, so let's get into that speech proper and get to break it down. One thing that interests me is the issue of the commodities exchange that everyone talks about. Now, that will help our farmers. At least they'll be sure of returns, you know. So tell us how that works and how you think that can be implemented here in Nigeria. We used to have it before now.
Yeah, let me start this way. I know you want us to go straight into, but let me start this way too. I'm not usually the type that gives so much weight to inauguration speeches. But then some will argue that that kinds of gives you a pointer to what a new government wants to do. So if you compare, let's look at the positives first. If you look at the inauguration speech from Obasanjo's time, okay, in 1999, agriculture or food was only mentioned on a particular line in the entire speech, okay? And that was when he was listing his priorities. And after all challenges with oil producing nations, he started talking about food supply, okay, food security and agriculture. Then if you move on and look at Yaradua and Jonathan, there was no mention of food or agriculture in their speeches. Now come to Buhari. Now in his own speech, all right, you could only see agriculture was mentioned once, and it was in reference to promoting, unemployment. I mean, how to reduce unemployment. So he said we'll promote agriculture. Now, but then if you look at this government speech, the inauguration speech, you can say, okay, a session was dedicated to agriculture, and they seem to mention specific things they want to do. Now, however, it can also be argued that saying something does not mean you really do what you've mentioned. So it's more important to analyze actions than speeches. However, for the sake of discussion, if we look at the speech, what you mentioned has to do with commodity exchange boards to guarantee rural incomes. Now, I have a challenge with that. Why? The issue is this. The major things that determine rural income, they are the things we need to focus on. Because when you start coming up with commodity exchange boards, all right, it was once in existence, then it went off, and then somehow it's coming back. Looking at the level of corruption in Nigeria, if you have such boards, will it not add another level of bureaucracy for the farmers? Will farmers not have to pay bribes to get their goods properly graded or graded to what they are not supposed to achieve? So that is another issue. It will also take out from their income. And if you now say you want to run it by the private means, private sector coming in, who pays for it? Is it the farmer or is it the government? So I would rather want us to pay attention more on issues like how far is the place of production to the nearest market? Market in the sense that not structure where it can be purchased. What are the access roads to those production hubs like? Okay, those things affect the price that a farmer eventually gets for his commodity. Because if where he's producing is too far and nobody can go there, he can easily sell off his products just to get something at whatever price. Now, if you have surplus also, the simple law of demand and supply will affect the price a farmer eventually gets. Those are the things we need to do. If he produces surplus, who mops up the excess? How does the government ensure that those surpluses are mopped up and farmers get the right price for those produce? And then those kind of things I think should be more focused on than us having a commodity exchange board. Well, some might also argue, but it will help the grading of products. But that is also when you are looking at export, more likely, not like for food you want to produce within the country. So the question is, first, how do we ensure that farmers get the correct price or prices for their produce without necessarily creating another layer of bureaucracy, knowing Nigeria as we are?
Very important stuff there. But initiatives instituted before now, one of it is the Anchor Borrow Scheme, which according to the central bank, about more than ₦1 trillion was spent around that. We also have some fertilizer plans, and the NSIA was also involved at a particular time with bringing in fertilizer with the Russian and Ukraine crisis, which was, of course, a challenge with regards to that. If you were to assess these initiatives and these interventions, how well would you say they have impacted productivity?
Well, just going back to some of the discussions we had earlier, Tolu, I've always said this, that these projects and those one-time initiatives, they are not bad in themselves. But my concern is when you want to build, you build on something, okay? If not, by the time this current CBN leaves, I've always said it, because CBN governor leaves, what happens to agriculture and some of those initiatives? My question to you would be, what is the price of a bag of rice produced locally now? Because we remember when they brought this rice pyramids in Abuja and everywhere was filled with news of. My question is, has it affected anything in terms of the price people pay to purchase a bag of rice? If it has not, then we need to go back to the foundation, as I've always said. The proper foundation has to be laid. And when it is laid, right, you can build on it. There's something currently wrong, and it's obvious, we all know, with the agricultural sector. It's not just working. If a country that has millions of hectares of arable land cannot feed itself, we should ask ourselves, okay, if I go back to the speech, one of the things the president mentioned was that agricultural hubs will be created throughout the nation. I don't have issues with that. But my question is, what is happening, or what has happened with the existing agricultural hubs that we have? Are they producing more? And if they are producing more, what is productivity like? So these are the questions we need to ask. And I want to believe that this present administration needs to look at things differently, honestly, if they want to get results from the agricultural sector. Or else we will just be going round and round and making no improvement. So we need to ask ourselves, when we have this kind of projects or programs, how is it going to impact in a sustainable way? Let me ask you, those loans that were given through the Anchor Borrower Scheme, how much has been repaid? What is the percentage of repayment? And if those monies don't come back, how can it be recycled to get to other farmers? There are many questions that need answering. But you see, when you have a country where corruption sits enthroned, it's difficult to get answers. And that is why we are where we are now.
Mechanized farming is also important, and in that speech, the livestock sector will be introduced to modern practices. That's what the president is saying, and of course, that's mechanized farming. How do we mechanize farming when we are not injecting as much funds as should be injected into that sector? We know the percentage of budgets that should be coming naturally to the agricultural space, and that is not happening. How do you think we can mechanize farming in this part of the world? Make it attractive for the young ones. A lot of tech guys are getting into agriculture.
Yeah, you're very right. Unless we move our production to that mechanized state where we produce in large scale, there's no way we can really feed ourselves as a nation. Now, the picture is such that you have about, up to 70% or more than 70% of the populace involved in agriculture, and we can feed ourselves. In other climes, you have just about 5%, of the populace, involved in agriculture. They are feeding themselves and they're exporting. The secret is technology mechanization. So how do we bring this on? It has to do with commitment. Let me go back to the Economist report on the Global Food Security Index. When they started drilling down on availability, there's a particular indices there where they looked at food security assets and then policy commitment to food security. You know what is called Nigeria? 0, while the mean average for all other countries was 47.1 in terms of score. In terms of volatility of production, Nigeria was scored 91.2 or 3. So you can see that production is very volatile. Commitment from the government is 0. So we've been talking about mechanization. Do you know since when I've been hearing about mechanization in agriculture? Primary school. And I've always said it. Anybody can bear me witness. The same problems of agriculture when we're in primary school those days are still the same problems today. So we can move to mechanization. How I think we can is to, for first of all, the incoming Minister for Agriculture. First of all, I've said that ministry should not be used as a compensation ministry. It should they should look for someone who is capable, who can answer the question of why are we hungry in Nigeria? Why are we food poor in Nigeria? So when you have the head, galvanizing commissioners, like you can look at each state, look at their particular situation and find a way of where you can inject mechanization into the particular food crop they have comparative advantage of producing. See, my challenge is that everybody always looks at the national and blame. Most analysts are guilty of this. But what is happening in the states? If you buy 1 million tractors, they are still going to be sent to the states. It's still going to depend on how those states manage them. They either sell it to their cronies or they divert it to something else. So if we have all this happening, we need to do things differently then. How? How do we get these farmers in a way that they have direct access to some of these inputs? It has been tried so many times, but you always have corruption and one thing or another coming up. And at the end, every government is going to be assessed based on those indices or indicators that they met and the one they are living. So I think that beyond mentioning mechanization, which state government, all right, or which national government has gone into mechanization head-on or headlong, trying to ensure that every area has an input of technology such that our production can multiply. I haven't seen that for how many years now, and that's why we're having what we're having. People end up paying more for food. You just read a report now talking about household consumption dropping. Why? Why won't you drop? People don't have enough. And the little they have, they spend up to 70% of that amount just to buy food. That's not what you have in other countries. All right? Countries outside Nigeria, some of them, 10% of their household income goes to food, and they have enough to do other consumption, to spend on other consumption.
Well, let's wrap up on this note, Dr. Ojo. What challenges do you foresee in the actualization of some of these lofty ideas already being introduced?
Thank you very, very much for that. The major challenge I see is if we want to build on this particular foundation, it won't work. Okay? So this government needs to do something. I've said it before. Review and ask ourselves, why are we in this position? The person in charge will need to lead this. If it will require us having a national agricultural summit, call all the agricultural commissioners that will eventually emerge, call all the stakeholders in the agricultural sector and sit down and say, look, we have a problem. We as a nation needs to be able to feed ourselves. How do we go about this differently from what we'll be having so that we have a new result? If that is done, you can see so many probably suggestions will come out, and then we will need to back it up with commitment. If we do that, we might begin to see things in a new way. If not, if we just want to just say sweet things and do things here and there, we'll get this kind of haphazard results that we are getting. A nation so big, so huge, with huge potentials, but still can't feed it ourselves.
I must thank you so much for your time. Dr. Matthew Ojo joining us from the United Kingdom. He is a researcher and agribusiness economist. Do enjoy the rest of your day and the weekend.
Thank you, Tolu.